TrekProfiles Podcast, Episode 11, recorded August 2018. This is the Trek Profiles Podcast, where each episode we sit down with a Star Trek fan, we learn their story, and we try to figure out why this show matters to them, to us, and to all of you. I am John, your intrepid host of this whole enterprise, and I welcome you to this, the Trek Profiles Podcast, Episode 11. If you wish to get in touch with us, you can reach us at feedback@trekprofiles.com or on Facebook or Twitter at TrekProfiles. If you wish to leave us a voicemail, you can leave a voice message at our automated voicemail line at 609-512-LLAP. That's 609-512-5527. You can also send us a voicemail message using the Tricorder Transmissions website. Warning! As we record this, we have reached the end of Season 1 of Star Trek Discovery, so all previous Trek content up to and including that point is fair game and may be discussed during this episode. You have been warned, human. With me here is my co-host, the devious, imperious, obsequious, but never tedious M5 Multitronic Unit.
M5 at full power and standing by.
M5, what information and news do we have?
Messages on the main screen.
The Trek Profiles Podcast is a proud member of the Tricorder Transmissions network. We have so many great shows on the network, and if you're a Trek fan, there's definitely something for you at Tricorder. Check it out, www.thetricordertransmissions.com. If you enjoy this or any of the shows on the network, please consider supporting the network on Patreon. Support at any level gets you access to extended and early release episodes, some uncut episodes, and admittance to our Patreon hangouts, which are always a super fun time. Another way you can support this or any of our shows is to visit the show page in iTunes and give us a nice rating and review. And if you aren't an iTunes user, that's okay, we love you too. We'd appreciate your rating and review in whatever platform you use. Those reviews help other fans find our shows, and we appreciate them so very much. Your humble host has been putting more extensive show notes up on TrekProfiles.com, so if you want more information about any of our recent guests, or to find links to any of the additional resources that we mentioned in today's episode, head on over there and you should find what you are looking for. In other news, I've made a commitment to doing some Facebook live streams. If you are interested in any of those, please check us out on facebook.com/TrekProfiles, where I'll post dates and times at least a week in advance. I would love the chance to chat with all of you, so hopefully I'll see you there. Your humble host attended a special Trek-themed taping of Let's Make a Deal a few weeks ago as I record this. What an amazingly fun time. The episode is tentatively scheduled to air in February 2019. I'll be sure to share the date again as it gets closer. Special thanks to listener Yesenia, who gave me a lift, and all the members of the LA Star Trek Away team who were out in force that day. Such a great group to hang out with. If you're in LA and you're a Star Trek fan, you should definitely go check them out. Let's review the Kobayashi Maru questions from Episode 9 with Dr. Aaron McDonald. As a reminder, I tweet these out after each episode where you can have your say. First question. You're going on a little trip to Bajor. Which province are you most looking forward to seeing, Rakantha or Dakur? Dr. Aaron said Dakur, and so did all of you by 83 to 17%. I'm not sure what the attraction was. Both locations seem to be rather kind of dusty and lousy, but Dakur it is. Second question. Temba, his arms open, or Sokath, his eyes open? Dr. Aaron said Temba, his arms open, which signifies gift-giving. Sokath, his eyes open, which signifies understanding, came in a far second at 30% to 70% for Temba. So gifts beat understanding for all of you. Personally, I'm all for a little bit of peace, love, and understanding. Third question. You're thirsty. 2 fine libations are on offer. Sluggo Cola or the Muskin Seed Punch. Dr. Aaron picked the punch, but y'all did not, and in a stunning upset, Sluggo Cola won by 62 to 38%. I thought that Sluggo Cola would not have stood a chance, but that shows the surprising nature of the Kobayashi Maru. Fourth question. Who is more annoying, the very needy and demanding Elon of Troyes, or the smarmy Luddite Alixis? Tough choice here. Dr. Aaron said Elon, but all of you selected Alixis by 53 to 47%. Both of these characters are rage-inducing in different ways, so I totally get the close call in this case. Fifth question. You are the science officer on a Starfleet ship. The captain tells you that you can choose the next science mission. Shall we investigate a pulsar or a stellar black hole? What's your pleasure? Dr. Aaron said pulsar, but all of you wanted the stellar black hole by 58 to 42%. All I'll say on this one is that y'all should strongly consider the opinion of the actual astrophysicist in the room when making these kinds of decisions. That's all I'll say about that. Please be sure to have your say on Twitter after this episode to weigh in on your thoughts about this episode's Kobayashi Maru questions. That's it for the messages and news. Moving right along, M5, load and play our interview with this episode's guest.
Acknowledged.
His favorite character is Mr. Spock. His favorite ship is the Enterprise Refit. He is the Vice President for Litigation and holds the Duncan Chair in Constitutional Government at the Goldwater Institute. You can find him on the Twitter at Timothy Sandefur. He is from Phoenix, Arizona, North America Earth, in Sector 001. It's Tim Sandefur. Welcome, Tim, and thank you for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Tim, it's time for question one. Are you a Star Trek fan?
Oh, yes. I've been a Star Trek fan for over 30 years.
Did you grow up with it, or did you come to it later in life?
I pretty much grew up with it. My parents tell me that even when I was very young, I was into Star Trek. But I remember getting into it in 1986 after seeing Star Trek 4 in the theater, and I became really a Star Trek fan from that point on.
Have you seen all the episodes?
I've seen all the episodes of the original series. I would say I've seen probably 80 or 90% of Next Generation. I've seen all the episodes of Enterprise, which I rather enjoyed, even though I know it's not really everybody's favorite. And I've seen maybe a third of Deep Space Nine, and I think I've seen maybe one or two episodes of Voyager. I have watched the first season of Discovery, though.
Animated series?
Oh, yeah, I've seen about half of the animated series episodes. I keep telling myself I need to go back and watch them, but I just haven't got around to it yet.
You know, I will say this, Tim. When you look at the animated series, you have to think to yourself, this is something they made in the early 70s for kids on Saturday morning cartoons, and they were pulling some very freaky stuff when they put those episodes on.
You know, that's
because
true.
Some of it is bizarre.
Oh, that's true in the entire original series universe. I think people underestimate how the original Star Trek is really more like Twilight Zone than it is like the Star Trek that we've become familiar with in the recent years, where each episode really is meant as a standalone sort of thought experiment, whereas today Star Trek is largely, an alternate universe where everything has to be internally consistent and stuff like that. That never works with a lot of episodes of the original series. You just cannot make City on the Edge of Forever consistent with some kind of canon. It makes no sense at all as part of an overall narrative. But it makes great sense if you think of it as basically a standalone episode that's like the Twilight Zone and those anthology shows.
Do you feel that hobbles the later incarnations of Star Trek, notably Discovery, that they have to be serialized? And mostly, I would just say that that's probably a symptom of being made in 2018. I think that's sort of what television audiences are expecting. But
Totally.
Do you feel that diminishes it in some way?
I do think it diminishes it, although Discovery would be the one exception, I think. I think it diminishes it in the sense that I suspect that people making Star Trek felt their hands were so tied by the canon that that's what gave the rise to the atrocity that is the J.J. Abrams reboot.
You're going to have to say a little bit more about that, Tim. I can't let that go.
Oh, the senseless, mindless J.J. Abrams crap that it's so stupid that it might as well be Star Wars. Is the reason for that, I suspect, is that it just became too challenging to tell interesting and compelling stories while keeping within the strictures that were set down by the canon of so many series doing so many different things. And I don't blame them for feeling that their hands were tied in that respect. Discovery, I think, actually does it to the extent that it works, which I don't think is very well. But to the extent that it works by a little bit thumbing its nose at the canon, just a little bit. And I kind of like that. I appreciate that. And I think it gets back to the spirit of the original series, which was less concerned about canon than about telling stories that made you think.
Are you going to go back and make yourself a completist at some point and watch all the episodes and get totally caught up?
Had I but world enough and time.
I don't blame you. You know what? I rewatch all the episodes that we're going to talk about on these podcasts that I do. And, not that it's a bad thing having to rewatch a bunch of Star Trek, but having a day job and a family, it's certainly challenging.
Right. I mean, I would rather rewatch an episode of the original series than try to get into, than to watch anything of J.J. Abrams or anything of Discovery. But I would like to complete my knowledge of Deep Space Nine, for example, which I think is a fantastic show, although I'm not really sure I consider it Star Trek.
Say more on that point, please.
Well, what I mean is, although obviously it fits in the canon and everything, it lacks what I consider to be the essential features of Star Trek, which is exploring strange new worlds, traveling through the galaxy, and having this sense of mission that's rooted in exploration and what I consider to be fundamentally Enlightenment values. And Deep Space Nine is much darker, much more, it has that soap opera quality. It has a lot of warfare and treachery, all stuff that Roddenberry would never have had anything to do with. And I think it does a very good job of it. Some episodes of Deep Space Nine are just magnificent, incredibly well written and fascinating stuff. But it could be any other show and work just as well. It just doesn't, it lacks the qualities that I think are really essential to Star Trek.
Well, for what it's worth, I'll say that I think Deep Space Nine is probably the show that has benefited the most from modern entertainment, in that it's a show that lends itself towards binging and streaming very, very, very well. Oh,
the story arcs are fantastic. Extremely well done.
Have you ever felt compelled to collect anything Trek-related?
Oh, yeah. I used to have a huge Star Trek collection. I did sell most of it years ago, but I still have a few items stored away.
What kind of things did you collect?
I had anything I get my hands on when I was a kid. Some of my favorite things were I had a Star Trek The Motion Picture matchbook. I guess, just as a part of the promotion for the movie for smokers, with all the matches still intact, and had a nice little decanter that was Spock from the motion picture. That was kind of neat. And then I wrote away, I don't know if you remember this, in Star Trek V, Spock uses a machine to make a marshmallow, and Kraft Marshmallows did a promotional thing where they would if you sent them proofs of purchase, you could either get a marshmallow dispenser that looked exactly like that, or walkie-talkie communicators. And I went for the walkie-talkie communicators, and I think I still have one of the communicators in the closet somewhere.
I have a totally in-box, unopened set of those communicators.
Oh, that's great. Mine is used and scratched up. It's worth nothing, I'm sure, but yeah.
So if you were growing up on Ferenginar and you got those Marauder Mo action figures, you'd have left them in the plastic. You wouldn't have taken them out and played with them.
Yeah,
or you would have played with them.
Well, I don't know. There were some things that I have been very careful about, like I have 3 or 4 of the original Hallmark ornaments that I know are worth a lot, and I've been very careful about those. But for the most part, I'm not really a keep-in-the-box guy. Although, actually, I'm sitting in my office right now, and to my right, about 2 feet away, is my mother-in-law gave me, as a Christmas present, the Star Trek itty-bitties that Hallmark made, the little plushy characters of the original series crew. And I had to leave them in the box because the box is so cute that it's the bridge background, and they just wouldn't be as nice if I took them out of the box. So I've left those in the box. But usually I'm not an in-the-box guy.
Oh, that's fantastic. It's funny because a few months ago in my day job, I won an award, actually, and it was kind of a big deal. And what had happened was the person who's in charge of this whole project and running all these events said to me, you get to pick a prize out of this catalog. And she sent me this thing, and it had all these men's cufflinks, right? And they were like these diamond ones and these really fancy ones. And I said, well, I'd really like a pair of Star Trek cufflinks, because I wear French cuff shirts to work. Yeah. And they're only like $35 as opposed to like these, $300 things you're sending me. So I wear these Star Trek cufflinks to work, and they make me so happy.
Excellent.
It's such a silly thing, I know. Have you ever been to a convention?
Yes, I went to the last convention I went to was several years ago, but it was the Creation Convention in Pasadena. I don't remember what year it was, but I'm sure listeners will know because it was the one where the earthquake hit during the convention. And
oh my goodness!
It was a very small earthquake, it was like 4 or something. But 3.5 maybe. But by the end of the convention, by the end of the day, they were already selling T-shirts that said, "I survived the Creation Con earthquake earthquake, which I thought was hilarious. And another item I got there was one of the blankets from Star Trek VI, the wool blankets. And I also took that out of the package. If I had left that in the package, I'm sure it would be worth hundreds of dollars. Although, see, the reason I'm not an in the package guy is because you could lease a square foot of my house for more than that, which means that it's not worth it for me to keep that in its package in a square foot of my house for all these years. So I'm not really into the keep it in the box. My Star Trek wool blanket is out of the package and usable.
Nice.
But yes, and in fact, I got an amusing story. My friend Scott and I went. Scott's middle name really is Kirk. And we went in costume, of course, and we were standing in line for the costume contest when Leonard Nimoy, who I guess had just finished an interview or something, came out of this room, this hidden door we didn't even know there was a door there. Door opens, out steps Leonard Nimoy, looks at me and says, hello, and walks on, and the two of us nearly fainted. And then later on in the day, Scott went to the restroom and stood at the urinal next to Walter Koenig. And he's very proud of the fact to this day that he did not, say anything to him. Or, try to get his autograph or something. He just played it cool. And that's
hilarious. So what costume did you wear?
2 through 6 red, of course.
Oh, the Monster Maroons.
Yeah.
Oh, nice. Very nice.
The only true costume. I mean, I'm an original series guy, but I love the red uniforms.
Oh, no, they are definitely quite dapper, for sure. I toyed with the idea of buying a really nice set, but I'd rather spend my quatloos on some other things. Yeah. Fortunately, I've avoided the collecting bug, so there's not too much stuff I spend money on, but that's always great. So do you think you'll ever go back to a convention?
Yeah, if time permitted. I wish, actually, I really wanted to go to this last convention in Vegas, but I had to be out of town for work. But yeah, it'd be the problem is, of course, that the things to attract me to a convention decrease over time, since I'm much more of an original series guy than anything else.
Oh, I got you. Well, I think that when you first start going, it's all about the panels and seeing the talent and all of that. Yeah. But as you go, you tend to meet people, and it becomes about these concentric circles of things that are sort of outside the convention itself. It's meeting up with the tribe and seeing these people that you interact with on social media and so forth. So,
and I love seeing people's homemade costumes and stuff and things like that. It's just amazing. Actually, I have one even better than this. I don't know if you remember in 1989, I think it was right before 6 came out. They did this event called Sit Long and Prosper, where they showed all then 5 Star Trek movies sequentially at movie theaters across the country. And I went and watched all 5 back to back. And the big reason to go was at the end, they showed the very first ever preview of Star Trek VI to show you what was coming up. And I got a little lapel pin that says Sit Long and Prosper. And that was fun.
Oh, that sounds great. I missed that. Where was I? I was in college, I think. Yeah, I was in freshman year of college back then, so I missed that. But that sounds totally like the kind of thing I would have done if I'd have known about it.
91. That would have been 1991. That's right. 91.
Oh, no. Okay, that would have been after. Okay, that would have been after that. So I want to talk about how I actually found you and invited you on the show, because I think it's an interesting story. So I was doing some research for another guest on the podcast, and I came across an article that you had written in the Claremont Review of Books called The Politics of Star Trek. And it was quite a lengthy article and clearly well-researched. And it was obvious to me that you'd done a lot of thought about it. And then I found another podcast that you'd done talking about it. And I'll put up links to those in the show notes that I'll post on TrekProfiles.com so people can easily find that stuff if they have a desire to go see it. But you certainly make a number of controversial statements, and I think a number of statements that I think would be very interesting to dive into. But I want to do that in the context of some of the episodes that you mentioned. Sure. And I want to
let me say to begin with that the best thing about writing that article was I actually got paid to write about Star Trek, which was truly living the dream. So.
Hey, man, there's no judgment here. I think that's outstanding.
After all this time, it finally happened. Somebody paid me money to write about Star Trek.
I think that's great, right? It's truly is a dream. I can't just being able to do something like that and write about something that you love. It's fantastic, right? I realize it's an old saying, but it's do something you love and you'll never work a day in your life, right?
Absolutely.
So let's start with a twofer, and we're going to go back to the original series. And I want to talk about the Apple and Return of the Archons. And I want to talk about them both together, I think, because they both revolve around a very similar premise,
right,
where the Enterprise is, on its missions, and they discover a culture on a planet which is best described, I think, as stunted. In both episodes, the ship is in danger from something that's happening on the planet. And in both cases, there's some sort of demented computer running the place. Now, that's basically the premise of both episodes, right? They're pretty much identical. Right. But you identify a very big difference relating to the character of Spock in these episodes. So why don't you tell me about that?
Well, so in the Return of the Archons, now that was one of the very first episodes ever made, and I suspect that the reason for this difference is really just that they found that there was a greater dramatic possibility in having Spock be a little different in the second version of this story. But in Return of the Archons, Spock and Kirk agree that the computer that runs this society as an oppressive, theocratic, dictatorial regime must be destroyed. Landru must be destroyed in order to allow the humanoids who live on this planet to flourish and pursue happiness as they have a right to do, as they have a universal right as sentient beings to do. In the Apple, it's a little bit different. Kirk is of that view, but Spock hesitates, and Spock expresses what comes to be developed as the prime directive, that it's not the Enterprise's business to interfere with this culture. And he expresses sort of this detached interest in the culture. He calls it an interesting example of symbiosis or something like that. And he has this sort of position as if he was a museum curator looking at this society under a glass. And Kirk and McCoy both are, especially McCoy, are horrified by that attitude. They say, no, these people are sentient beings who have a right to pursue happiness and their own destiny as they choose. The message, basically, of both episodes is the same, which I think the reason why I find The Apple such a fascinating episode, I think it expresses the real spirit of Star Trek, the real, what Gene Roddenberry's vision of Star Trek really was, is this idea, this post-World War II liberal idea that there is such a thing as universal right and wrong, that expressly rejects the idea of cultural or moral relativism and says that all people everywhere have a right to freedom, and if they're being oppressed, that it's morally wrong to turn your back and say, oh, well, that's their business, that's not my business. So both of the episodes express that idea. It's just that they put the idea of cultural relativism into the mouth of Spock in The Apple.
So you take The Apple more as a political story rather than a religious one?
It's a little of both. I mean, because it's a theocracy, so it straddles the two. But I don't think it's narrowly political in that it's not a piece of political propaganda. It's a statement about what it means to be free and the right of all people everywhere to be free. And it's very telling, of course. People giggle about this, but it's very telling that at the end, when Kirk is explaining freedom to them, he talks about sex, because, of course, the biblical story of Genesis portrays that as original sin, as the moment when Adam and Eve cease to be, mindless cattle in the Garden of Eden and become as gods, knowing good and evil. And so Kirk is sort of Kirk is the serpent in this Eden, and that's a good thing. That's the whole point of that episode. And also of Return of the Archons, although, it's a little bit less explicit there.
One of the things that jumped out at me rewatching Return of the Archons was when Kirk makes his plan and says to all the people in the little dungeon cave that they're in, including Reger and Marplon, the two locals, that we're going to go and destroy Landru and all of this and that Reger and Marplon, who are in some sort of resistance cell, don't want to do it. They seem terrified of the idea, which it seems like it's something that they've been working towards. Yeah. But they seem totally terrified of it. And it reminded me, and this might be my own insanity, but I'm curious what you think about it. It reminded me of Plato's cave, right? The idea that if you lead people out of the cave, right, they don't want it. Yeah. They'd rather go back in and be ruled by our beneficent overlords.
That's right. Freedom is a terrifying prospect in some ways because of the the fear of having to make all those choices, the intimidation of facing all of those choices, that is a very frightening thing. And it's always easier for us to prefer what turns out to be an illusion, which is a world in which everything is planned out for us. And Star Trek, at least in its original form, is fundamentally anti-utopian. This is written, it can't be emphasized strongly enough. Star Trek was written by people who had gone through World War II. Some of them were literal veterans of World War II, like Jimmy Doohan, and some of them, and Gene Roddenberry, and some of them were people who at least had witnessed it from the sidelines, and they knew that there really was such a thing as actual evil, not just cultural relativism, oh, that's not my taste, that's a different culture, that sort of thing. These people knew that there was such a thing as actual evil, and that it had to be combated, and that the way to combat it, the only way to combat it, was to pronounce moral judgment and not to shy away from the obligation as thinking beings to say when something is right and say when something is wrong, and to fight against the wrong and fight for the right. That's a spirit that I fear Star Trek has lost over the previous couple years, and it's a tragedy. But both The Apple and Return of the Archons and other episodes are written out of that spirit. And actually, I was just recently watching an episode of Next Generation that I thought was I had never seen before. That it was an interesting twist on this, and it's called Who Watches the Watchers, and it's an episode where there's a Federation crew observing this culture on a planet from behind a hologram screen, and the screen fails, and the locals see the Federation personnel.
Right, the primitive Vulcanoids.
Yeah, exactly.
That
and Picard, and they mistake Picard for God. And Picard is at one point urged to go ahead and say, yeah, I'm God. And he repudiates that idea in no uncertain terms. Absolutely clearly could have come from the pen of Gene Roddenberry himself. Picard says, I will not encourage these people down the path of superstition. And it's beautiful. The episode is a little weird, especially at the end. It seems to end abruptly with no real resolution. It's terribly written at that point. But that moment in that episode is pure Star Trek. That's the Apple. That's Return of the Archons right there that says, no, there is right and wrong. There is reason and there's superstition. There's justice and there's injustice. And we have to take sides. And I love that.
One of the things that was very clear to me when listening to your previous podcast and reading your article is that you see a very strong break. And I think a break is the right way to describe it, between the Federation that we see in TOS and the Federation that we see in TNG. So let's talk about that for a second by bringing up another episode that the M5 is telling me we should talk about, which is Symbiosis, which is a TNG episode, season 1, episode 21. This is the one where we have Merrick Buttrick and Judson Scott, the two previous actors who were previously on Star Trek, and we discovered there's these two societies that are having one society is selling this other society drugs, and they're telling them it's medicine, but they're actually addicted. What was your reaction to this episode, and why is it on my list?
It's a horrible episode, but let me pause for a second to say I would disagree a little bit with your premise, which is I don't think there's a break. I think there's a gradual degradation of Star Trek during the beginning seasons of Next Generation. There are a lot of episodes of Next Generation that still have that original Star Trek spirit that I'm talking about. And over time, during Next Generation, you see it turn into the ideas of moral and cultural relativism and who am I to judge and that sort of thing. And Symbiosis is a good example of this cancer in Star Trek, in my view. In that episode, Picard says when he finds out that this is going on, he refuses to stop it. He refuses to take an action to stop this from going forward. And Dr. Crusher is rightly horrified by this and says, wait, these people are keeping these other people addicted and exploited and oppressed, and you're not going to do anything about it. And Picard says, well, that's the prime directive. That's the rule. And there you go. And then he says what is truly amazing. He says that the history of all species shows, and all human history shows, that for one culture to try and help another culture and is to oppress it and impose its values and all this sort of this is insanity. This is obviously written by people who have no memory of things like the Marshall Plan. That to say that is a moral blindness that is inexcusable. And I think it's important to point out that in the original series, the Prime Directive was made to be broken. The reason the Prime Directive was introduced into the original series was as a foil, as an example of the bureaucratic mindset that must be overthrown in the name of doing justice. Obviously, neither the original series nor any other Star Trek is blind to the fact that there is oppression and exploitation and that bad things can happen when one culture comes in and intrudes into another culture. But it is also not childishly blind to the fact that there is such a thing as wrong, universal wrong, and that it is our obligation as human beings and as thinking creatures to take a stand against it. So in Symbiosis, Picard, he thinks he's doing a virtuous thing. He refuses to take action to liberate an oppressed species and thinks that he's being a good person for it. And it's shocking.
One of the things about the episode that stuck with me is, besides the horrible "just say no" speech from Tasha to Wesley, which is just face palming. I want to do the Picard face palm every time it comes up.
Well, you'll remember that there was that we found out sometime in the 90s that the DEA or some federal agency was actually paying Hollywood writers to write this stuff, and I suspect that this is an example of that. I don't know that for sure, but I suspect so.
Well, in some of my research for this, Maurice Hurley, who was one of the behind-the-scenes writers, and I think he was actually running the writers' room for at least most of season 1, he worked on Miami Vice before this, and I think he brought some of that sensibility to, let's do shows about drug deals or something to the show. So that might have been part of it.
Right.
But it seemed to me that the Prime Directive was, as you say, just a prime suggestion. And it was something that they were free to disregard whenever they felt the need to. But I think even in universe, it seemed like something that only ever applied to pre-spacefaring civilizations, which these two were not.
Yeah.
So
right. I hadn't even thought of that. That's a very good point. Yeah.
It seemed just totally irrelevant.
Yeah.
But
and I think it's worth emphasizing because Star Trek is based loosely on Captain James Cook, indirectly, because Kirk is based on oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I was about to say Mr. Midshipman Easy, but no, he's Horatio Hornblower.
Hornblower.
And Hornblower is based on Midshipman Easy, and Midshipman Easy is based on the voyages of Captain Cook in the 18th century. And that's to say Star Trek is about enlightenment. It's about the Enlightenment. It's about the idea not just of going out and exploring strange new worlds, but also of liberating people from the self-imposed blindness of superstition, dogma, myth, tyranny, and oppression. And that's what Star Trek is written out of. Now, you may consider that naive, but it is nevertheless what Star Trek is about. And it's the reason why it's such a shocking betrayal for Picard to say, no, I refuse to take action, is that it's turning his back on that and saying if a foreign oppressor wants to imprison and enslave another people, it's none of my business. And of course, it's everybody's business. If it's not everybody's business, then the promise of never again that was made after the Holocaust is a sham. And Star Trek was written by people who knew it should never be a sham.
You're reminding me of that quote from Lincoln when he was talking about Douglas in the debates.
Yeah, well, not just that, but I mean, and incidentally, when talking about Lincoln, remember that Captain Kirk is a great admirer of Abraham Lincoln, and what Lincoln says in response to Douglas's racist attitudes in the 1858 debates is that the Declaration of Independence is written for all people, and that while one person may not always be the equal of any other person, he is always my equal and the equal of Douglas and the equal of every other man when it comes to the right to put food into my mouth that my own hand has earned. And that's true not just of human beings, Star Trek tells us, but of all sentient creatures. Well, by the time Star Trek VI comes along, that attitude is now being referred to by Star Trek as, quote, racist, end quote. The idea of universal human rights is sneered at by Star Trek VI, not in a sarcastic or comedic way, but is rejected expressly as being racist because it uses the word inalienable, which isn't even what inalienable means. But of course, they get the quote from Shakespeare wrong in that movie also, since the undiscovered country is death and not the future. No, Star Trek 6 is such a mess. That would spend an entire day, an entire separate podcast. But let me just say this faculty of moral judgment is a crucial aspect of the original Star Trek, and you see it most effectively in The Conscience of the King, which is expressly about the Holocaust. Kirk has survived a metaphor for the Holocaust, and he encounters somebody who is a metaphor for the Nazis, who at the time that this episode was airing were still hiding out in places like in South America. And Kirk, at one point, when his daughter, when I can't remember the character's name, I'm sorry, but when the daughter says, "Who are you to judge?" Kirk's answer.
As it were.
Yeah, in Conscience of the King, the daughter of...
Oh, Lenore.
Yeah, Lenore. When she says, "Who are you to judge?" Kirk's answer is, "Who do I have to be?" Which is one of the most beautiful episodes in all Star Trek. That line alone is genius. That is what Star Trek is about. Who do I have to be to point out that evil is evil, that oppression is wrong, that slavery and servitude and ignorance and superstition are bad things? Who do I have to be? Do I have to be God? Or can I, as a thinking citizen of the universe, say that all thinking citizens of the universe have a right to be free to think for themselves?
I think you're right that Conscience of the King is certainly an amazing episode, and it certainly is an interesting meditation on what was going on in society at the time, because it's hard for those of us in 2018 to remember this, but at the time that the show was airing, there were actual trials still happening of Nazis who had been recaptured.
That's right.
That was actually happening at the time that the show was on the air.
That's right.
So it certainly would have had a powerful relevance for the people who were watching it. But
and incidentally, Conscience does a good job, by the way, of being fair to both sides. I mean, it's not a propaganda piece. It is when McCoy says, "How will it help the dead to bring this man to justice?" And Kirk's answer is, well, they might sleep a little bit better. The dead might rest a little easier. Well, is that really a satisfying answer? I mean, the episode does a great job of dwelling on the real dilemma of whether it's right to spend that much time and energy tracking down people who did injustice in the past. And it's interesting, we're recording this just days after the U.S. government, in fact, extradited a 95-year-old, I think he was, former Nazi prison guard. Now, was it really worth the time and effort to bring this 95-year-old man to justice and send him out of the country to be put on trial for crimes against humanity? Personally, I think the answer is yes, but I don't think it's an easy answer. I think it's a perfectly reasonable position to say, look, that's the past, and we cannot ever get over the past if we keep constantly meditating on it. I think that's a valid point.
Tim, I'm an Armenian, and we had our own genocide that has never quite been acknowledged in the full historical context, and Turkey still refuses to believe that it even happened. They don't use that term, which was invented, by the way, to describe the thing that actually happened at the time to my people. Yeah. So it's a thing that haunts us. And so when I watch an episode like Conscience of the King, it's something that really affects me deeply. Yeah. But I want to go back to Star Trek 6, and I want to give you a quote from your article, and I want you to say more about this. So this is right out of your article in Claremont Review. The previous films, and you're talking about Star Trek 6 here, the previous films had focused on questions of loyalty, friendship, and Spock's need for feelings to leaven his logic. But this one, written in part by Nimoy, would be the first devoted expressly to political subjects. It comments on the waning of the Cold War by portraying the first steps towards peace with the Klingons. Yet the price of peace, it turns out, is not merely to forgive past crimes, but for the innocent peoples of the galaxy to take the guilt upon themselves. Say more what you mean there about taking the guilt upon themselves. Well, the episode is supposed to be about how Kirk is prejudiced against Klingons. I mean, the movie is supposed to be about that. And at the end, at the trial scene, when Kirk's private diary is played for the judge, and he says, "I've never trusted Klingons and I never will. I'll never forgive them for killing David." We're supposed to see that as Kirk being a bad guy. And when they're in prison and Kirk is laying there in the bunk bed and he's kind of thinking to himself, and he tells McCoy, Spock was right. We have to not be so prejudiced against the Klingons. I mean, that's crazy. The Klingons have never
apologized for their crimes against the innocent peoples of the galaxy. And these are real crimes. I know it's fun to think of it as Kirk chasing the Klingons and it's just a racial thing or something like that, but that's not what's going on. If you listen to and take seriously the logic of the original series, this is a group of people who tried to murder everybody on Organia, who tried to poison the entire food supply of another planet in The Trouble with Tribbles, who have raped and plundered and murdered whole races of the galaxy for generations. And we are told at the end of Star Trek VI, the whole resolution of the action at Star Trek VI is when Azatbur says to Captain Kirk, "You have redeemed my father's faith." Well, the right answer to that, and what Kirk would have said in the original series, is screw you. Who am I to have to redeem your father's faith? It's the Klingons who, at a minimum, owe it to the sentient races of the galaxy to apologize for their past conduct, to acknowledge the crimes they have committed against the peoples of the galaxy. And they don't do that. They never do it. Instead, Azatbur says, quote, "We are a proud people and we intend to go on being proud." Proud of what? What do the Klingons have to be proud of? Absolutely nothing as far as the original series is concerned. And yet all of that is brushed aside in Star Trek VI as though the Klingons are innocent victims of Homo sapien prejudice, so that the Klingons are being told, or so that we're told that this is alien conduct and so forth. I mean, racist conduct is what I meant to say.
Let's talk about Star Trek Insurrection. I have a little quote here from the article. I'm not sure I'm going to read it, but this idea that you have that Kirk and Picard might have had very different reactions to the Baku, living in their peaceful idyll on their planet. So if we all remember, Picard says that the Federation could learn a lot from the Baku, and you seem to take a lot of exception to this. Yeah.
Well, this scene, of course, was taken out of the movie, if I remember correctly. But the Picard is at the end was originally supposed to say to the Baku, who are these people who have chosen to give up technology and live in this sort of agrarian utopia. He was supposed to say to them, well, we could learn a lot from you. And there's absolutely nothing that is there to be learned from the Baku, according to the original series, as far as I can tell, because they have abandoned the spirit of discovery and learning in order to tend their own garden. You know, it's like in Candide. The whole point of Candide was to parody the idea that it's sufficient to sit there and tend your own garden, because there's a lot of work to be done to free the peoples of the galaxy and to learn and discover and explore strange new worlds. And the Baku are not interested in doing that. They just don't care. They have the technology. They just don't care. And we're shown this footage of them that's shot like a commercial for the Bed Bath & Beyond or something, in this loving sort of way. And it's utopian. It's fundamentally utopian. And not just utopian, but anti-industrial utopian. As though if we all lived in an agricultural commune, we would all have peace and plenty. And, you know, the movie began with Picard saying that he missed being an explorer. But now at the end, he comes to the resolution of the story is that he's learned to not want to be explorer. He's learned that the Baku have the right way of living, which is in retirement on their farms. Now, you know, Picard has a soft spot for farming, fine, but it should, that at least, you know, they could have brought that out, and instead they don't, because the whole point of that scene was supposed to get us to sympathize with the idea that going out and exploring and discovering is really an intrusive bad thing, and what we ought to do is just sit at home and plant potatoes.
One of the things I think Star Trek has been particularly bad at in all of its incarnations is portraying societies, whether large or small, as monolithic in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And whole planets, too. I mean, you land on a planet, the entire planet's a desert. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, but I mean, even societies, right? I mean, if you look at the Federation, it seems to me a relatively lifeless place. I don't have that sense of, the Greek word eudaimonia, right? Human flourishing, of like a dynamic and vibrant society. And I thought a lot about this. And on some of the other podcasts that we've done, one of the ideas we were kicking around is that it seems like there's not a lot of civil society. There's not a lot of things outside of Starfleet and the Federation.
Maybe. I don't know. I think that's a little bit I think if you look at the original series, it's a little different. And I think if you look what Roddenberry had intended to do with Star Trek Phase 2, it's a little different. I think we would have seen a little bit more of the civil society stuff. Remember in the very first, in the cage, we see people walking the hallways of the Enterprise wearing civilian clothing. And we see that a couple times in the first episodes of Next Generation. And we see, in the original series, we see shopping malls. And in the first episode of Next Generation, we see shopping malls. And we see a little bit more of that. It's because the whole show is set on essentially a Navy vessel, and this really gets into it in Next Generation, that you're right, we get a sort of a bland picture of what the background civil society is like in the Federation, and that gets even worse as time goes on. But there is a little bit of it there. I mean, Cyrano Jones has to make a living somewhere.
Yeah, I think you could probably do a whole episode or many episodes on just trying to figure out how economics would even work in the Federation, right? I mean, even if there was a zero scarcity society when it comes to physical things, food and all of that, when you move up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, there's these other things that people still need, but there's also, you have to have some way to adjudicate experiences, right? Yeah. What if everybody wants to go to Risa? I mean, you have to have some way of sorting these things out, right?
Ilya Somin, I think, has written a lot on this. He's a law professor at George Mason University, and he's really into the economics of Star Trek and things. And I'm more interested when it comes to this stuff in the ideas of justice. And so I'm fine with putting aside the utter economic incoherence of Star Trek. I mean, at first there's no money, and then there's gold plus latinum, because you can't really have no money, and that's fine. I can live with that.
Although in one of the episodes, I think it was the Apple, Kirk says to Spock, "How much has Starfleet invested in you?" And he actually blurts out a number, right? He doesn't finish, so we don't know if it's credits or gold plus latinum bars or who knows. But it really this is why, especially on this show, and I think with the other people I talk to, right, I don't really have a lot of patience for talk about Star Trek canon.
Yeah.
Because the Star Trek has never promised us a consistent world, right, where everything was internally consistent and everything was carefully thought out. I mean, there were some people that tried to hold the whole thing together with twine and duct tape, but it just does not work.
And as I said at the beginning, I think that's a handicap to Star Trek. I think Star Trek works better if you're a little loose with the canon. And here's a fun brain twister I've been playing with, which is I think it's possible that the motion picture is not canon. The motion picture is never mentioned in any other Star Trek. And instead, at the beginning of 2, Kirk is back to being a desk-bound admiral again. How did that happen? There's debate among the fans about whether there was a second 5-year mission after the motion picture, because that's the only way you can really make sense of this weird anomaly. And it makes a lot more sense if you jump straight to Star Trek 2 and skip over the motion picture and regard motion picture as on its own. Now, I'm a little bit sympathetic to the motion picture. I know it's a very unpopular movie. I think it works better if you think of it as just a music video for the beautiful Jerry Goldsmith score. But actually, Star Trek the Motion Picture is kind of a small, if you can call it small, 3 hours, precis of Gene Roddenberry's vision of Star Trek. It's got everything in there and a little extra, which is the problem with the movie, but it's got this idea of, God is made in our image, so you got the humanism. You've got the idea of, transformation through love with Ilea and Decker. And most importantly of all, you have this idea that we mentioned at the beginning, that Spock is wrong, which is so beautifully articulated in that magnificent scene when Spock is in the sickbay after he's tried to mind meld with V'ger, right, and Kirk is holding his hand and Spock's crying, and he looks at Kirk and he says, "This simple feeling is beyond V'ger's capacity to understand." At the beginning of the movie, we saw him trying to become V'ger. Right, he's trying to attain Kolinar and purge himself of emotion, and he thinks that's his right destiny, and he's actually kind of angry about the fact that he's had to give it up in order to join the Enterprise crew again. But then he discovers that logic is the beginning of wisdom and not the end, and he's holding Kirk's hand, and that's a magnificent climax of the story. In 2, 3, 4. And so forth, what we did in that trilogy, he kind of goes through that evolution all over again. So I think if you have to take motion picture out of the canon and set it aside as sort of, a sort of an epic poem version of Star Trek.
You know, some of the things I appreciate about the motion picture, which, first of all, I will agree with you, I think it's underrated, and I do love it, is that, first of all, you got a sense that Starfleet was actually an organization with human beings in it that had politics. Yeah. And, you know, there was negotiation and there was, you know, all this wrangling about taking the ship away from Decker and all that. Also, it actually showed that operating a starship is hard work.
Yeah, right.
You don't just get on there, press the button, and off you go.
Oh,
right?
but in 3, apparently a chimpanzee and 2 trainees can run her. It's amazing. 7 people can run a starship. It's crazy. 6, I guess.
So let's continue talking about the movies now. In your article, this is when you were talking about Into Darkness, one of the J.J. Abrams films. And let me hit you with just a couple sentences here. You say, the breakdown in liberal principles that once guided the series, Star Trek's romance with relativism, gradually blotted them out until the franchise came to prize feeling over thought, image over substance, and immediate gratification over moral and political responsibility. What was once an expression of the Enlightenment faded into darkness. Tell me why Into Darkness evoked this reaction from you.
Well, this is all of the J.J. Abrams movies are about things blowing up, and isn't that cool? There's really hardly any story to speak of in these movies, but in Into Darkness particularly. Now I get them mixed up because they're all so stupid that they kind of meld in my brain. I can't remember which one is
Into
which.
Darkness is the remake of Wrath of Khan.
Yeah, that's right. So it shares this with the first one. Those 2 movies, in both cases, we are told basically that the reason Kirk is in the captain's chair is because he's some kind of superior human being. We're really given no reason why Kirk is made captain. He's not particularly smart. He actually himself says in one scene that he doesn't know what he's doing, and he means it, and everybody knows he means it. And Leonard Nimoy then all of a sudden appears out of nowhere and says that Kirk is supposed to be in the captain's chair because that's just the way it's supposed to be, which doesn't make any sense. I mean, it's this idea that there's like superior beings and inferior beings, and which is what Star Trek's supposed to not be about. I mean, the whole point of it is supposed to be that we're all created equal, that we attain our gifts by hard work and pursuing them. And instead, the whole J.J. Abrams thing, it's just sort of, you know, well, Kirk is in the captain's chair because that's just the way things are supposed to be. There's a little profit to be had in trying to analyze these movies, because Abrams himself is not a Star Trek fan. He said so in interviews. He said that he grew up not liking Star Trek and thinking that it was just a bunch of people standing around talking. When that is indeed what Star Trek is. And so he tried to put laser guns.
Some of the best episodes right there are just people standing around talking.
No question. I mean, the probably the best Next Generation episode, Brothers, I think is the title of it, when Picard goes back to visit his brother and recover from having been captured.
Family,
that's it. You know, that's entirely dialogue. So that's, it's the point of, to the extent there is a point, the point of the J.J. Abrams movies appears to be that strength conquers all, and it's physical strength. It's not any kind of intellect. It's not a belief in values. And at the end of the first of the J.J. Abrams movies, he gives this speech. Kirk gives a speech where he says, well, you know, that's just not who we are. Well, you know, that's it. That's the entire justification of who and what their values are. Or anything. It's just, that's not who we are. What does that mean? It doesn't make any sense. It's not intended to make sense.
One of the episodes that the M5 has told me we should talk about is Survivors. That's season 3, episode 3 of Next Generation. It's the one where we discover this old man and his wife living on a planet that has apparently been destroyed by some alien race. Why did this episode show up on my list?
Well, so that is another example, like Symbiosis, of this doctrine of moral relativism in the guise of the Prime Directive coming to dominate Star Trek. And we find out in that episode that this man has murdered an entire race of beings. He's committed genocide on a scale that no human has ever attained.
And billions of people. And
when he tells Picard this, Picard's response is, we can't judge you by our laws. So I assume that means that the Federation has no laws against genocide? Obviously, that can't be the case. What he's really saying is that, well, who am I to judge? You know, this is, again, the exact opposite of what this show was supposed to be about. It was supposed to be about paying attention to the principles of universal liberty and the right of all thinking beings to be free to think and to pursue their own lives. And instead, in this episode of Next Generation, we have Picard, again, turning his back on it and saying, who am I to judge? If that's the standard, what do you do about Hugh, who introduces the virus, the computer virus, to the Borg of individuality? One of the best moments in the Next Generation, in my view. I mean, hasn't the Next Generation then committed genocide by introducing that? The idea of individuality into the Borg matrix. So, no, it does. That episode, again, is another instance of this sort of, I don't know why, but the lost sight, the series lost sight of the fixed stars by which the Enterprise used to navigate.
In preparing to do this podcast, we'd exchanged a couple emails, and in one of your emails, you made reference to the episode Bound of Enterprise, Season 4, Episode 17, mm-hmm. and you actually said it is one of the most, I'm quoting you now, one of the most horrifyingly immoral episodes of Star Trek ever made, which is a pretty bold statement.
Yeah.
So explain yourself, sir.
I feel at this point that I've criticized Star Trek so heavily, I have to reiterate, I'm a huge Star Trek fan. I love Star Trek. And I love what it was committed to at the beginning. And one of the reasons I enjoy the series Enterprise so much is because it's obviously a show for people who do love the original series and want to see more of it. But one of the real blind spots in Star Trek is that it really never discussed slavery. In all of Star Trek, they discuss race. Abraham Lincoln even appears in an episode, but there's never a discussion of slavery. And we know that slavery is going on in the universe of Star Trek because from the very first episode of Star Trek, we see slaves, a Green Orion slave girl who's dancing for Captain Pike in the cage. Mm-hmm. And so we know slavery is going on, but Kirk never confronts it. Now, he's never called upon to do so, and you can't tell every story, fine. But in the episode Bound, we see some slave girls. And the climax of the story is when we are told by the Orion man that it's actually the girls who are the enslavers and that they have enslaved the men by their pheromones, their capacity to drive the men crazy with desire. And this is so talk about blaming the victim. I mean, this is so tone deaf. I can't believe that it actually aired, and not in a spirit of satire. The whole reason why certain other nations in this world oppress and enslave women and force them to cover every square inch of the skin of their bodies is on the theory that they're so desirable that men will lose their minds if they see their ankles, and so they must be covered up in order to hide from the gaze of men, and et cetera, et cetera. This is putting women on a pedestal in order to enslave them, and it's been done time and time and time again throughout history, not just in the Arab world, but even in ancient Greece. And here we see Star Trek doing exactly the same thing, telling us that these slave women, whom we've seen bought and sold, in just an episode or two earlier of Enterprise, we saw them being sold at an auction, are nevertheless the actual enslavers. And at no point is this repudiated. At no point does somebody say, wait a minute, that's BS. These women are being oppressed by you, and you're using this as an excuse to put the blame on them, and it's shameful. That's never done. So it's really quite shocking that got to the screen, and nobody seems to have noticed it. I don't understand.
The gender stereotyping in the episode is horrifying. The objectification of women in the episode is quite distasteful.
Well, and literal objectification. I mean, when Star Trek is funny in its treatment of women in that it came out during the sexual revolution, and so the mini skirts and stuff, we now kind of make fun of that, and in some cases people even think that that's a bad thing. It has to be understood in context at the time that was incredibly liberating. And the sexuality in the original series was incredibly liberating. And, Roddenberry was pretty overt about this fact. He said at one point that he had been treated like a sex object once and he loved it and all that sort of stuff. It was a different time and it had different mores and they were rebelling against different things. But in this situation, we are talking about literal objectification. These women are slaves who are bought and sold on the market for the gratification that they bring to their masters, and then the master tells us that they're the ones who are doing the wrong. It's really amazing.
Well, it's even, it even goes outside the outside the bounds of the show, I mean, even the way it's shot. I mean, there's one scene where one of the women is walking down the hall and like the camera is lingering on her calves as she's walking down the hall. It's the way it's shot, just everything about it.
Yeah, you're right. There are some good sides to it. I make no apologies for the fact that I find Green Orion slave girls sexy. Sorry.
No, they're lovely, but it's like this episode is just so problematic in so many ways. Right. I just kept thinking to myself, how could anybody be sitting there at what was it, Paramount at the time or UPN or whatever it was on, thinking this episode was a good idea? Right. It's amazing to me. Now, it's interesting to me that you have a position as a litigator in a public policy organization. You're obviously a busy guy. But yet you're finding time to write articles and do podcasts about Star Trek. So that tells me that Star Trek must occupy a special place in your heart in some way. And you made reference to that earlier. Say more about that. What do you think is the best of Star Trek?
Oh, the best of Star Trek is when it confronts us with dilemmas that are intensely human. And, that was what it was intended to do. Roddenberry had in mind... he had in mind Gulliver's Travels because he wanted the Enterprise to go around and confront situations that made people think about our present lives. And sometimes it's done in a little bit of a ham-fisted way. Sometimes it's done in an over-the-top way, like, let that be your last battlefield and stuff. But its heart is usually in the right place, and I love that about it. Even though I find, I'm not a 60s liberal, and Star Trek, I think, can be classified as sort of 60s liberalism. So I find myself disagreeing with the positions that Star Trek takes at times, but the fact that it engages it at all is great. And Star Trek has become a fixture of American culture to such a degree. I would say that a character like Mr. Spock is every bit as much a fundamental part of American culture as Huckleberry Finn is at this point. So I think it's part of what it means to understand American civilization, to understand at least the rudiments of Star Trek and what it was about and what it was trying to do.
So you made reference early on that Mr. Spock was one of your favorite characters, but yet you've also said that one of the points of Star Trek is saying that Mr. Spock is wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, now I have to give credit. I actually got this insight from my mother when I was a child first watching Star Trek, and I admired Spock so much. And at one point she said this to me, that Spock is wrong. And that's right. The entire point of the character of Spock is that he's wrong. And what I mean by that is that Roddenberry invented this character, one of the first ideas he had for Star Trek, as a way of sort of pointing up what it means to be human by having a character who wants to understand humanity a little bit better and is not himself human, although he's got a little bit of human in him. And it's got that sort of Pinocchio aspect that later is put into Mr. Data in Next Generation. But it's also more than that. Spock actually does become human over the course of Star Trek. And he does so by discovering, repeatedly, that logic really isn't the answer, that you can't get there by laying aside your emotions. And the arc of 2, 3, and 4 does this quite beautifully. Everybody focuses so much attention on 2 because 2 is such a great movie, and that they sort of lose sight of the fact that it's the first step in this 3-step trilogy that really has to be taken as a whole. At the end of 2, Spock says the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one. And then the Star Trek 3 comes along. At the end of Star Trek 3, when Spock has been rescued, he says to Kirk, "Why did you do this?" And Kirk's answer is, "Because the needs of the one outweigh the needs of the many." So, and both of these things are true. There's an old saying that the opposite of a fact is a falsehood, but the opposite of one great truth is very often another great truth. And that's what 2 and 3 do to us. 2 says, one great truth is that Spock loves Kirk, and their bond is so strong that Spock would unhesitatingly, truly without a single instance pause, get up from his seat and go die for the sake of saving the Enterprise and his crewmates and Captain Kirk. And then in 3, they throw everything away. I mean, at the end of 3, Kirk has nothing. He has lost his son. He has lost the Enterprise, which we know from previous episodes matters more to him than anything. So Kirk has lost everything in order to save Spock. And when Spock says, "Why did you do this?" Kirk's answer is, "Because the needs of the one outweigh the needs of the many." And in 4, the final climax comes when the question arises of whether to save Chekhov. And Kirk turns to Spock and says, is that the logical thing to do? And Spock says, no, but it is a human thing to do. And it's such a beautifully elegant, wonderfully written moment. That's the moment when Spock becomes human. And the sort of the denouement of that is at the end when he's speaking to Sarek, and Sarek says, your shipmates are people of good character, and Spock says, they are my friends. And he has at that point become a human being. And there's a little note that one of the positive things about Star Trek VI, which I've said so many bad things about, one of the good things about that is that there's a nice little note at the end, in there when he says to Valeris that logic is the beginning of wisdom and not the end. You must have faith that the universe will turn out as it should. And that's the him speaking from experience, because that's what he's done. He has gone from the point of Kolinar to the point of knowing that logic is an incredibly important part of being a human being, but it's not all that there is. It's beautiful. That's what one of the most important ideas in all of Star Trek. And it's very easy to overlook because we all love Spock so much. We enjoy his intellect and his logic so much. It's easy to lose sight of the fact that the fundamental point about Spock is that he's wrong.
I agree with you that is one of the most beautiful moments in the movie. And I will say, though, there's a moment that's even more relevant for me because I have a small boy, and whenever he misbehaves, I find myself quoting Star Trek VI, and I say, what you wanted is irrelevant. What you've chosen is at hand. I didn't mean for that to happen.
I remember when 6 came out, and we were all so excited, and I loved it. The music was so good, and the look of it was so great, because Meyer really understands that, as he said at the time, that drama takes place in small enclosed spaces. And so he made the Enterprise small, and we see things like the China being shattered and all these little details that really make it look great. But it just falls apart in terms of logic and morality. And so it just cannot be deemed a good movie. And there's so much wrong with it. I mean, Star Trek VI, Klingon blood all of a sudden looks like Pepto-Bismol. And then it goes back to being red again in the next movie, or in the next series. And it just hasn't. This is made canon in Star Trek VI, and all of a sudden it disappears. And the cutting phasers, where did that come from? And all this sort of stuff that's just arbitrarily dropped into the movie. It's almost like a tragic travesty of what Star Trek is.
Or actually having a kitchen with people actually, peeling potatoes in it.
And they do that because they want to have that enclosed feeling that Meyer knows is good for drama, but it doesn't make sense within the logic of Star Trek. And here I've been dissing canon, and so I should say I'd be fine with that if it contributed to a dramatic purpose that really made sense. But it didn't really, and especially the scene with the books and the translator. And that scene is put in there for comic relief. It makes no sense at all. Why, if the universal translator would be recognized for the first time in all of Star Trek, then why couldn't they look up the words on the computer and then read them into the microphone in their own voices? Getting out a bunch of hardback books is stupid. It's just done for comic effect, and it doesn't even make sense. The joke just falls flat. Yeah, there's a lot wrong with Star Trek VI.
Doing the kind of work that you do and having the background that you have, I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Hayek.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that Star Trek as a cultural phenomenon is emergent. It's something that was not designed really and handed down on stone tablet. And so we just have to accept the things that come bubbling up in it as the things that are of value and things that...
You mean within our culture?
Yeah. And even the way that it was written, it's people have come to it and added something new to it, right? And a new wave of writers, a new show, and they've put their own spin on things.
That's true, and even within the series, that's true, because Star Trek was one of the very first shows. It and Lost in Space were the two first science fiction television shows that were not anthology shows, and so the writers came to Star Trek with anthology shows in their minds, and they approached the original series as an anthology show in a lot of ways. As I said, it's a lot like Twilight Zone in that respect. And so what emerged from Star Trek in that way was a spontaneous order in the Friedrich Hayek sense. And more than that, like you said, as a cultural phenomenon within our culture, Star Trek not only did it evolve that way, but for many years Paramount encouraged that. Paramount encouraged fan participation in Star Trek in ways that it doesn't do anymore, and it's a real shame. But it was fine with fans making their own movies and TV shows and making their costumes and all this sort of. They encouraged it. They were perfectly fine because they saw that gave a real strength to the franchise. And it's sad to see Paramount cracking down on people making their own fan movies and things like that now, and turning it into just another franchise focused on money instead of a community of ideas.
Well, there was, without getting too far into it, there's actually a reason for that. I don't know how familiar you are with it, but there was someone who was trying to make a fan film, and they should have let him. It turns into, this is why we can't have nice things.
Well, I know there's complexities involved, but I think Star Trek was, there was a time when Star Trek was the only show in Hollywood to accept unagented, unsolicited scripts from fans, and episodes were made based on scripts that fans would send in. The episode The Empath from the original series, the episode Silicon Avatar from Next Generation were written originally by fans. Obviously, they were kind of changed in the process, but that's how they began. And then just a couple weeks ago, Discovery put up a tweet on their Twitter page that said, please don't send us scripts, because it's all become, well, as a lawyer, I can say this, it's all become a bunch of lawyers.
Oh, dear. Well, you know what Q said about all the attorneys, right?
Yeah,
right. Encounter at Farpoint.
Right.
So, Tim, I have enjoyed talking with you. I really have. But the M5 is a harsh taskmaster, and he's signaling me that it's time for the Kobayashi Maru simulation.
All right.
The Kobayashi Maru is a challenging and difficult test, cunningly prepared by the M5. Should you not only survive the test, but pass it as well, the M5 will award you an honorary Star Trek title. Are you ready?
As ready as I'll ever be, Captain.
All right, M5, load the Kobayashi Maru simulation and prepare to record the counselor's responses.
Simulation loaded and ready.
Question 1. Shakespeare in Star Trek. Too much, not enough, or just right?
Just right.
Worst prison in the galaxy, the mines of Remus or the frozen wastes of Rurapente?
Oh, Rurapente, of course.
Who is your shuttle pilot, Will Riker or Tom Paris?
Oh, Riker.
You're hungry, so you head over to the Replomat, but there's only 2 items available today, Spock's Plomeek soup or some of Sisko's jambalaya.
Oh, Plomeek soup, of course. I gotta try it.
The Riker maneuver or the Picard maneuver?
Picard maneuver.
Simulation complete. M5, compute the results and tell us if our guest has passed the Kobayashi Maru.
Analyzing results.
Now, I assume by Picard maneuver you meant when you stand up and tug down on your uniform jacket.
Yes,
okay.
And the Riker maneuver is when he always throws his leg over the chair.
Throws his leg over the chair, yeah. Oh, no.
In fact, there's even a video that someone did
I've
of
seen it.
Yeah, it's just hilarious. Oh my goodness. Okay.
How did I not notice that when the show was originally on? How did every time you do that? I never saw it. I don't know how that happened, but it... Yeah.
It's one of those things that once you see it, it cannot be unseen. Right? Every time he does it, you're like, oh, there he goes. There he goes.
Well,
there he goes.
I guess it just must be Jonathan Frakes just had to show off his trombone.
Well, I heard somewhere, I don't know if there's a canonical or real explanation for this, but he had an injury somewhere, and it just made it more comfortable for him to move like that. I don't know if that's actually true or not.
Yeah, I bet you I know how he got his injury.
Oh, dear. I'm sure it had something to do with a trombone. Okay. And now, the M5, who has analyzed your answers, will award you an honorary Star Trek title on behalf of our podcast. M5, what title shall we award our guests?
The counselor is awarded the title of Professor of Law at the University of Utopia Planitia on Mars.
Thank you so much. It's an honor.
I feel like their sports team name would be like the Ares Astronauts.
That's a good one.
I don't know. It just came to me. All right. Tim, please tell people how they can get in touch with you, because I think you've certainly hit on some controversial points here, and I think some fans might want to engage with you. So what's the best way for them to do that? Sure.
You can find my blog at sandefur.typepad.com. You can find me on Twitter at Timothy Sandefur. And my email address is tmsandefur, SANDEFUR, @gmail.com.
Fantastic. And I'll put links up to all of your blogs and the article and the other podcasts that you've done up on the show notes pages at Trek Profiles. So all that'll be there as well.
All right.
Tim, thank you so much for being a part of Trek Profiles podcast. I appreciated having you on the show.
Thank you.
Here ends this installment of the Trek Profiles podcast, and before we offer a Trek quote to close this episode, I'd like to remind you that you may send us your useful and relevant comments, haiku poems in honor of the M5, or your recipes for a nice plomeek soup to feedback@TrekProfiles.com or on Facebook or Twitter @TrekProfiles. Anything you may send us may be used in the show, or may be fed to the giant snakehead computer Vol as tribute. This week, I leave you with a quote from Captain Kirk, who said in the episode, The Apple, quote, "You'll learn to care for yourselves with our help, and there's no trick to putting fruit on trees. You might enjoy it. You'll learn to build for yourselves, think for yourselves, work for yourselves, and what you create is yours. That's what we call freedom. You'll like it. A lot." Close quote. Thanks for listening, and live long and prosper.
Go, Ares astronauts.